And welcome to the Rob Kall Bottom Up Show. My guest for this show is John Kiriakou. He's a former spy and a whistleblower. He worked for the CIA and was involved in the capture of Abu Zubeidah. Then he was a counterterrorism consultant for ABC. He's the author of The Reluctant Spy, My Secret Life in the CIA's War on Terror, and The Convenient Terrorist, Abu Zubeidah, which just came out. But I prep for interviewing him for talking about his newest book, Doing Time Like a Spy, How the CIA Taught Me to Survive and Thrive in Prison. We'll talk a little bit about all of that stuff. Welcome to the show. Welcome back.
Rob. Thank you, Rob. It's good to be back with you.
So you did time in prison as a whistleblower for letting people know that the CIA was torturing people.
Yes.
And this book,
That's the one.
Doing Time Like a Spy, How the CIA Taught Me to Survive and Thrive in Prison, talks about your time there and what you used that you learned in the CIA. Now, learning about you as a CIA agent, you were a pretty kick-ass tough guy.
You know, it's funny because the people who have known me the longest just can't fathom that on a couple of occasions I sort of had to be a badass. But yeah, that's the life and that's the training. And you find yourself in these situations in godforsaken places around the world, and you just have to do what you were trained to do. So yeah, it's now, like leading two separate lives, to tell you the truth.
Now you started off being an analyst, and that's very different than the other side.
Completely.
So you were an analyst for how many years?
7.5. And
then, and what did you do as an analyst? Let's start with that.
Sure. Well, I was recruited in graduate school. I started working for the CIA the first week of January 1990, and I was assigned to Iraq, to work on Iraq from CIA headquarters. And the reason I was given Iraq was, and this is exactly what they told me, they said, nothing ever happens there. It's been the same cabinet, the same government since the 1968 revolution. So it's very slow. You learn the tradecraft, you learn the CIA writing style, and then if you do well, we can transfer you onto something exciting like Romania. And I said, okay, great. It was so slow that there were some days that we wouldn't get a single cable in. Nothing from the embassy, nothing from NSA, nothing from CIA, not even a press piece. I would just kind of sit there like, well, you know, they're right. Nothing ever happens in Iraq. And just at the time when I felt like I knew what I was doing, Iraq invaded Kuwait. And one of the old timers pulled me aside and said, I don't think you understand the gravity of this. He said, it's not unusual for the countries we cover to go to war, but it's highly unusual for the countries we cover to go to war with us. So he said, this is going to make you. Well, the day after the invasion, I have my best suit on. I go into the office and my boss says, don't sit down. We're going to go to the White House. And an hour later, I'm in the Oval Office with the president, the vice president, the national security advisor, and the CIA director. The president asks a question and everybody turns and looks at me. And I thought,
you've given reports to a number of presidents, right?
Yeah.
Who?
Let's see. I've spoken with George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and then I was asked to brief Jimmy Carter. Of course, he was an ex-president by then. But yeah, Jimmy Carter. I've met and briefed George H.W. Bush a number of times, and then I spent a full day with Bill Clinton at one point. So it was fun. It was exciting, you know.
Any difference in how you observed they were in terms of asking questions and processing information?
Yeah, big differences. The smartest one of them by far was Bill Clinton. But Clinton was also combative. He wanted to tussle and argue and debate, which was fun for me. George H.W. Bush was far more worldly and more sort of aware of the country's position in the world.
Well, he was also a spy. He ran the FBI, right?
Head of the CIA.
CIA.
He was ambassador to the United Nations. He was ambassador to China. He was director of the CIA. So he was Mr. Resume in that world. W was the friendliest of all of them.
The guy you want to have a beer with.
He really was. But not bright and not inquisitive and just, you know, W had this attitude where he believed he had hired the smartest people he could find, and he surrounded himself with the smartest people. And so he didn't need to be smart on these issues. His people would take care of it for him. And in fact, what ended up happening was that his people ran roughshod over him.
What do you think about how Trump would be operating? I know you haven't dealt with him, but what do you think?
You know, I've said publicly, I actually fear for the country for the first time in my life. The problem that Trump has is a problem that so many politicians that I've encountered also have. And that is that they believe they are the smartest guys in the room.
Hubris.
They're smarter than you are. It's hubris. It's narcissism. They're smarter than you are. So they don't need to know what you think about an issue. And they don't need to surround themselves with smart people because they're smarter. You know, God bless him, John Kerry was exactly the same way. John Kerry would bring all of us into his office, ask us really tough questions about, you know, foreign policy and intelligence, and then utterly ignore everything we said.
So, you know, this is the bottom up show, which looks at top down and bottom up. And it sounds like these guys were totally top down. A bottom up leader would depend upon, rely upon, and respect and value the information that the people he brings to him. And top-down leaders are going to look for confirmation of the opinions and ideas that they already have.
Do you remember Robert Mosbacher? He was George H.W. Bush's Secretary of Commerce. He was some kind of oil billionaire or something like that. I briefed him one time. He had a real interest in Kuwait, and I always wondered if his interest was financial for once he left government. So he asked for some really comprehensive briefings on Kuwait, and this must have been right after the war ended in 91 or maybe early 92. And so I went down to the Commerce Department with a whole gang of analysts, and this was really bottom up. And we went to his office, his private office. He asked very smart and very well-prepared questions. And I mean questions that went down deep into the weeds. And we answered his questions. We were there for 2 hours. And then, I don't know, a day or 2 or 3 later, my division chief, which is my boss's boss, sent me a note saying that he had a call from Secretary Mosbacher thanking him for sending these analysts over, and said it was the single most comprehensive briefing he had ever had as Secretary of Commerce. And I thought, well, that's the way you run something. You know, admit that you really don't know everything about some esoteric issue. You don't have to bluster your way through something and pretend that you're smarter than everybody. You know, I'll tell you, at the time, I wasn't smart about a lot of things, but there was nobody in the American government that knew as much about Kuwait as I did. And I was glad that he sort of recognized that.
And acknowledged it and gave you credit for it.
Yeah.
You know, one thing I've learned, regardless of who you're dealing with, even if it's just some convenience store clerk, you give them credit. I mean, if somebody treats me well and does a good job, I go, "Who's your manager?" I want to tell your manager that you did a good job.
I did that a week ago.
People coming up to them that they kind of cringe and,
yeah,
you know, I want to talk to you about Billy here. And I go, he did a really good job. And that's such a surprise because they're used to getting somebody complaining.
Yes. I did it a week ago at Target. You know, there was a cashier, and probably nobody's ever paid attention to this cashier. And she was so doggone friendly and efficient that I stood in line for 10 minutes at the customer service desk just to tell her manager how excellent she was.
Yeah, it's a big deal. Okay, so let's move on to the book.
Yeah.
So after 7.5 years, you went from being an analyst to being what?
Yeah, I switched over to counterterrorism operations, which was, really dangerous and really high stress. But to tell you the truth, I was so bored in analysis. I just couldn't imagine spending another 20 years sitting in this cubicle, writing papers about Saddam Hussein's next 12 months. So it just so happened that a job opened in Athens. And it also just so happened that I was the only person in the entire CIA who spoke both Arabic and Greek. And the job was calling for someone with Arabic or Greek. And so I went down to the counterterrorism center and I said, listen, I don't have any operational experience whatsoever. Nothing. I don't know the first thing. But I speak Arabic and Greek and I'm fluent in both. And the guy was like, oh my God. He said, well, it's a lot easier and a lot cheaper for me to take a linguist and teach him operations than it is to take an operations officer and teach him how to speak Greek and Arabic. So I got the job, and then I started going through the traditional operational
special operations training.
Yes.
What do you learn there?
Wow, everything from counter-terrorist driving to, which is crashing through roadblocks and trying to escape.
Like the movies.
Yeah, just like the movies. To weapons training on a wide variety of weapons, from sidearms and light guns to the big stuff.
Big stuff?
Big stuff. 50 cals, rocket-propelled grenades. We blew a lot of stuff up.
Oh.
We learned how to a lot of fun. We learned how to defuse bombs. Which was nerve-wracking but important. We jumped out of airplanes. We had to swim across swamps to make a dead drop. And then you learn just sort of the mechanics of recruiting spies to steal secrets. The bottom line is I have to, it's called the asset acquisition cycle. I have to spot, assess, develop, and recruit somebody. That's the only way I'm going to get promoted, is to recruit spies to steal secrets. And so over the course of this relationship, I'm going to convince you that I am your best friend, to the point where you love me, to the point where you're willing to commit treason for me.
Mm.
Yeah. And I found that I had a knack for it.
Now, CIA, that means you're doing this in other countries only, right?
Correct.
The U.S. would not have the CIA operating in the country, would they?
I do not believe that I can comment on that.
And that's not a no. Okay. Ooh.
Sorry.
So that's just fine. Thank you. So how do you identify somebody as a potential recruit?
Well, before 9/11, you'd go to diplomatic cocktail parties, you'd go to business events and just start handing out business cards and making chit-chat over a drink. And so if I meet you and you say that you're the economic officer from the Embassy of Switzerland, I say, okay, nice to meet you. And I go to the next guy because I don't care about Switzerland. But if I come up to you and you say that you're the Iranian media attaché, I'm very interested in you. And I'm going to invite you to lunch. And if you say yes, I know that I've got a shot, because the Iranians aren't allowed to say yes. Or if you are, let's say that you work at the port. I'm always interested in the port because things are coming in and out constantly, including perhaps precursor chemicals for cocaine, let's say, or for heroin processing.
Or bombs.
Or bombs, even better. So if you say anything in that first meeting, anything at all, Petrus, I'm going to invite you to ask you questions about yourself. What do you like to do in your spare time? What are your hobbies? Oh, you like deep sea fishing? Well, I'm going to charter a boat and I'm going to take you deep sea fishing and I'm going to show you the time of your life.
I assume you have a pretty good budget from the CIA to do that kind of thing.
Post 9/11, it was practically unlimited. Yes.
Now,
In
in your
fact,
book, you talk about how you could use money, that people needed money, that you could use money to get them.
80% of the people we recruited did it for the money.
Yeah.
80% of the people that we recruited knew exactly what they were getting into, right? Because you're going to be subtle, but you can't be that subtle that this guy doesn't know he's being developed by a CIA officer.
Did they know you were a CIA agent?
Eventually, well, you're going to begin hinting once you think that you're going to be able to get this guy. And then when you get permission from headquarters to actually make a pitch and offer to recruit him, you're going to just come clean.
What did they think you were when they first met you?
Oh, it could be anything. A State Department officer, a Pentagon civilian. If you're under deep cover, you could be anything. You could be a wildlife photographer, a museum curator, a businessman. It could be anything at all.
Is that your job to come up with, or are you told how to do it?
No. They assign that at headquarters, and then they give you a lot of training to maintain your cover.
So it's almost like you've got somebody or a team of people who are creating a narrative that you would base your identity on.
Correct.
So it's on. I ran a conference for 6 years on the art, science, and application of story. So it sounds like this part of working with this CIA agent is creating a story that they can then live.
Exactly.
Fascinating.
And it's very complicated, and it's very stressful. And as a result, the CIA has the highest divorce rate in government. It's upwards of 80%.
You survived that.
Well, my second wife was a CIA officer.
Okay. Until after they started just trying to destroy your life, which is the way they handle whistleblowers.
Yes. Yeah, my wife was a very highly regarded and highly decorated senior CIA officer. And she was fired from the CIA the day of my arrest, only because she was married to me. But you're right, Rob, that's what they do. They set out to ruin you, not just to charge you with a crime, but to ruin you financially, personally, professionally, to separate you from your friends and your family members, from former colleagues, from people who otherwise would be supportive of you. And they make an example of you so that the message is to other would-be whistleblowers. You see what we did to Kiriakou? We ruined him. You want the same thing to happen to you? No? Then you better keep your mouth shut.
So you're not necessarily, when you're doing this work, being a nice guy.
No, and you'll see that in this book. Prison's a nasty, terrible place full of nasty, terrible people. And so I do not portray myself as the good guy in this book.
Nor when you're a spy either. I mean,
no, because you're living a lie. Everything you do is a lie. It's all fake. It's all an act. Yeah, fully half of the people who I recruited, who I made think were my best friend, I wouldn't want to be caught dead with them on the street. They're either criminals or terrorists or scum or whatever. Certainly there were people who in another life, yeah, we would be buddies. I'd love to have a beer with them. I'd love to have them over to my house for dinner. But some of them were dangerous, killers, terrorists. You just have to put on that act.
You mentioned being in there with a mafia don.
Yeah. It was the Italians from the mafia in prison who became my closest friends.
Really?
My supporters.
Yeah. I gave a talk. I used to be involved in biofeedback and stress management. So I gave a talk at a local prison to the staff on stress management. And then they walked me around, and I got to see a famous mass murderer who had eaten people. And then they pointed out a don, the mafia don. And this is a little short guy surrounded by 6'5" guys. And he was a lot scarier than the guy who ate people.
Oh, yeah. Oh, listen.
I didn't want to have eye contact. It was like, get me out of here.
Oh,
you were friends with him, huh?
I became friends. There was a story that I did not put in the book that I'll tell you. People warned me too that the mafia has a very long arm, And one of them came up to me one day and said, "Are you writing a book?" And I said, "I am." "You putting Italians in that book?" And I thought, I'm not now, I guess. I did, but only in the warmest possible way. But there was one incident. We had the actual boss of the Gambino crime family at Loreto when I was there.
Now that's a minimum security prison that you were in.
It's a low. It's called a medium low.
Medium low. All
So
right.
I was not permitted in the minimum. So they put me. I mean, this was a real, honest to God prison with the double wall and the barbed wire and the guards patrolling around the perimeter and the whole 9 yards. So a friend of mine said, "The boss of the Gambinos is in there, little Nicky Carozzo. You need to stay away from him. He's a very, very dangerous man." And indeed, he was doing 12 years on 12 murder counts as part of a RICO case. So I did. I stayed away. And he was a tiny guy. He was probably 5'4", 5'3", but surrounded, like you say, with these giants. Well, I'd see him walking around the compound with his crew, and I kept a very healthy distance. Well, one day I'm sitting in my cell and I'm reading a book, and I see some movement out of the corner of my eye, and I turn and look, and it's one of his bodyguards, this enormous guy, like 6'6", that we called Stupid Tony, because he had cross eyes, and you could never really tell who he was looking at. So I turned and I looked at him, and all he said to me was, "The boss wants to see you. Let's go." And I said, "He wants to see me?" I hadn't ever met the guy. "Let's go," he says. And my heart is just pounding. Like, why in the world would Nicky want to see me? So I go down to his cell, and it was like a scene out of a movie. Nicky's sitting in a chair. There's a guy clipping his toenails for him. And when he finishes getting his nails clipped, he gets up. There's a sink right there. He brushes his teeth, and I'm just standing in the doorway waiting to be invited in. He's brushing his teeth, and he spits all over the basin of the sink. So he turns to a bunk bed. There's a guy sleeping in the top bunk behind him, and he punches the bunk bed, and he says, "Hey, get up. Clean this shit up." And the guy jumps out of bed and says, "You got it, Nick." And he cleans up all of Nicky's spit off the sink basin. So finally, I cleared my throat, and I said, "Excuse me, Mr. Carozzo, do you want to see me?" He says, "Come in, sit down. You the CIA guy?" And I said, "I am." "You write a book?" I said, "I did." "Your book do good?" I said, "Actually, it did very well. I made New York Times bestseller list. I made number 5. And he kind of nods, and he says, "You're going to write my book." And I said, "Oh, is that what this is about?" I said, "Well, let's think about this for a minute. Books in this genre are usually written by rats, and they spend the first half of the book talking about all the cool things they've done, and then they spend the second half of the book trying to justify why they turned rat." And I said, "You're clearly not a rat, and you probably shouldn't talk about the cool things you've done." And he nods, and he says, "Hadn't thought of that. Never mind." But from that day on, Rob, I was invited to every Italian dinner, every Italian party. I went to watch the Super Bowl with them. We exercised in the yard together, and they became my closest friends.
Wow.
It was a close call.
Endurance.
All worth it.
Yeah. So anything more that you learned when you were being taught to be an active spy that people would find useful?
I think so. And when
This is the kind of stuff that you would use in the prison too, I assume. That's in
yeah, and I also say in the book that it's actually applicable to daily life. I mean, the reader is gonna think this is cynical, and it is cynical. But I put these 20 life lessons in the book that I learned in CIA training and showed how I applied them to prison life. And some of them were sort of funny in that they were jokes at the CIA, but I took them very seriously in prison. Like admit nothing, deny everything, make counter accusations. And again, that was a joke at the CIA. It was on coffee mugs. It was on T-shirts. But I actually did that with the cops in prison.
Well, why would the CIA say that? Why would they advise you that? Because you're undercover?
Yeah. And somebody would say, oh, I think you're CIA. And, well, no, I think you're CIA. How do you like that?
So it's deception.
It was deception. Yes.
So interesting, because I've been accused of being CIA because
without a doubt.
I publish a blog, and because I have my own software for my site, and they say, oh, only the CIA could have paid for that.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
Software. But
that's a constant struggle overseas, is constantly denying that you're a CIA officer.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, in prison, I got called down one time to the lieutenant's office, and it was just to harass me. And so one of the cops says, why don't you tell me about that fight in the unit last night? I said, there was a fight in the unit? Oh, you're going to get smart now? I said, I didn't know there was a fight in the unit. I had my headphones on, and I was reading a book.
Like the dumb German sergeant in Ryan's Heroes.
Yes.
I know nothing.
I know nothing. Yeah, Hogan's Heroes. And, and so finally I said, I pretended to get frustrated with them. And I said, no, I think you were fighting in the unit last night. You seem to know all about this fight. The only way you could have known about it is if you were there. And you're trying to get me to admit it? Finally, they told me, get out of my office, which is exactly what I wanted to do. So there are other life lessons, too. Recruit spies to steal secrets or anything else you need. Everybody is working for somebody. When calm is not to your benefit, chaos is your friend. Use the subtle art of deception. Seek and utilize available cover. So I have 20 of these. And then I go through the book showing how I used them to protect myself.
So give another example from the ones you just listed.
Sure. It's not a nice example. And I think your listeners are going to think that I'm not a nice guy with this example. But, I say in the book that sometimes you just have to take the bull by the horns. There was a guy in prison with me who had dated an A-list movie star. And he stole from her, and he stole from a bunch of other people in Hollywood. And he ended up getting something like 5.5 years on embezzlement and fraud charges. So he was always bragging about how he had been in People magazine, and he had been in Variety, and he had been in Hollywood Reporter, and he had been on TMZ. And my God, I was just tired of listening to it. In addition, and this is what really bothered me, he was constantly trying to steal money from people, to trick them into transferring money into his account or into an offshore account. That bothered me a lot. And he cried constantly. He would cry when he got a visitor. He would cry when he didn't get a visitor. And I say in the book, we could even hear him crying in the shower. And so I told one of the Italians one day, I've had it up to here with this guy. I'm going to take this guy down. And he said, no, don't do that. You're going to end up in solitary. I said, I'm not going to be so gross about it that I'm going to do it right in front of his face. I'm going to do it the CIA way. So what I did was, one of my cellmates was being released. And when you get released, the prison administrators give you a form that they call a merry-go-round. And on your last full day in prison, you have to go from office to office to office getting a signature on this thing. You don't really need any of these signatures. It's just to keep you out of trouble that last day. And so I went up to this cellmate of mine, Jesus. I said, Jesus, can I borrow your merry-go-round? No questions asked. He said, sure, take it. So I took it. I made a photocopy, gave Jesus back his original. Then I whited out Jesus' name and number. I put this guy, I'm going to call him Wallace. I call him Wallace in the book. I put Wallace's name and number, made a clean photocopy so he couldn't see the whiteout. Then I stole a duffel bag from laundry, which they give to indigent prisoners when they leave prison to take away their belongings. I waited until 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon, and I put the forged merry-go-round and the duffel bag on Wallace's bed. So he comes in to the room. He says, hey, guys, I'm sitting there with one of the Italians. I said, hey, Wallace, how you doing? He walks over to his bed, and he gasps. I said, what happened? He holds up the merry-go-round. He says, I'm being released. I said, what? You're being released? How did that happen? And very proudly, he says, I won my appeal. I said, geez, Wallace, nobody ever wins their appeal. He says, well, I have the best attorneys. I have to call my attorneys. He runs to the phones. Well, even fancy attorneys are gone by 5 or 6 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. He calls the courthouse. They're locked up tight. He runs to the unit manager's office. He's gone. Case manager's gone. Everybody's gone. He comes back to the room and he's positively giddy. The Italian says, hey, Wallace, let us have a dinner for you. We want to have a dinner to celebrate your release. And the Italian was in on it with me. The next day, Wallace gives away all of his possessions. Just gives it all away. And we have this big going away dinner for him Sunday night. So Monday morning, a whole gang of us walk him down to R&D, receiving and discharge. And he gives us big hugs and come and visit me. We're going to take a Mediterranean yacht cruise and we're going to stay at my mansion in wherever. And the rest of the story I got from the cop in R&D, who was very friendly. So Wallace goes into R&D. And the cop says, who are you? He says, I'm Wallace. Cop says, what are you doing here? Wallace hands him the merry-go-round. He says, I'm going home. The cop looks at the merry-go-round and says, turn around, you're under arrest. Wallace says, why? Attempted escape. So they cuff him. They take him to solitary. He was there for 3 months. And then they sent him to another prison where he served out the rest of his sentence. Now, as it turned out, they did not charge him with attempted escape. He did not lose any of his good behavior time because they couldn't prove who had forged the merry-go-round. And he was adamant that he did not.
All right. Now, there's, I know this story. So
Yes.
I've been wondering, you're telling this story now. It sounds like you forged the merry-go-round.
Totally.
How come you're not in trouble?
Because nobody ever found out about it.
But it's now public.
Statute of limitations.
Statute of limitations. And you're not worried about this guy coming after you?
Yeah, he's a bozo. He was afraid of his own shadow. I'm not afraid of him.
Okay. So what's the lesson that we should learn from this story?
When calm,
Guys, don't F with a CIA agent.
when calm is not to your benefit, chaos is your friend.
Okay. So I just want to move on a little bit here. You spent time at the farm.
Yes.
What's the farm?
The farm is a secret, worst kept secret in Washington, CIA training base in Virginia. I think I'm only allowed to say Virginia. It's been identified, its location has been identified repeatedly in the press. But it's a very, very large, I'm sorry, say that again?
You don't want to say any more than
No.
Can you tell us what happens there, what you learn there?
Yeah, it's the primary CIA training site. So it's something like, it's well over 1,000 acres. Most of it's wilderness. But virtually all CIA training takes place there. Everything from the new analyst course to, counter-terrorist operations to, everything in between. I mean, I took a class in leadership, for example, that was at the farm. Sometimes you go down for a day, sometimes you go down for 6 months, but it's where all the action is.
So what did you learn in the class on leadership?
Honestly, I learned that the CIA has no idea how to identify potential leaders.
Really?
No idea. They think they do, but they're winging it. And this is an ongoing problem at the CIA. A CIA psychiatrist once told me, and I put this in the book as well, that the CIA actively seeks to recruit people who have sociopathic tendencies. They don't look for sociopaths because sociopaths have no conscience. And with no conscience, they blow right through a polygraph. But they're impossible to control because they never feel guilt. People who have sociopathic tendencies do feel guilt. They will get tripped up on a polygraph, but they're still happy to break the law when it's in the national interest. And I'll give you an example. When I was being interviewed for my CIA job. I was being interviewed by a panel of experts. It was a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and an anthropologist. And one of the questions they asked me, one of the questions they asked me was this. Let's say you've been tasked with recruiting a person overseas because this person has something in his office, maybe something on his computer that the CIA needs. So you develop this guy for 6 months or 12 months, and you come to the conclusion that he's just simply not recruitable. My apologies. He's simply not recruitable. So what do? And I said, you break into the office and you steal it. And they said, that's exactly what you do. Well, that's frankly a sociopathic tendency. The average American is not going to just leap to the conclusion that you break into this poor innocent guy's office to steal something from his computer.
Well, I've done a whole lot of interviews with experts on psychopaths and sociopaths and narcissists, and a couple of psychopaths themselves.
Yes.
And I did one with a guy who was the president of this an organization that studies psychopathy. And he did, or a team of his associates did a study of looking at presidents in terms of psychopathic characteristics, and they come up higher than average.
Just like business leaders do.
Yes.
And at the CIA, and this is really my point, you've just made it, at the CIA, just by their nature, sociopaths and psychopaths are going to slip through the process. And because they're psychopaths, they're going to rise to the very top of the CIA's leadership. And we saw that in spades.
We left out one other group, and that's members of Congress.
I would be fascinated to know how many members of Congress are psychopaths or sociopaths.
And ones that get appointed to run spy agencies.
Indeed.
Yeah. Okay, so let me go on with my questions here. So what is counter-surveillance? You talk about learning surveillance and counter-surveillance. What's counter-surveillance?
Right. Let's say that there's a surveillance team that's following a target. There's a counter-surveillance team, usually hostile, that's following the surveillance team. When you're doing surveillance against somebody, you're so focused on that target, you're not paying attention to who's behind you looking at you. And so if there's a probe is somebody who's sent into an American embassy as a walk-in. And I talked about this in my first book. Let's say somebody walks into an American embassy and they say, I want to talk to somebody from the CIA. So I'm going to put on a disguise and I'm going to meet them in a walk-in room. And the guy says, listen, I'm a member of Hezbollah and I've been sent to kill your ambassador. I wanted to tell you because I don't want to do it. Well, why is he telling me this if he's a member of Hezbollah? The chances are very high that he's made the whole thing up. He's not working for Hezbollah. He's working for the Russians, the Iranians, the Israelis, who knows? But he's looking to see where the cameras are. He's looking to see how thick the doors are. Are they reinforced with steel? How many people are armed that he has seen since he came in here? Am I wearing a disguise or no? And if I am, have I forgotten to take my badge off? Can he see my badge with my real picture and my true name? So the Iranians are particularly aggressive in this way. They do this all over the world, all the time. Well, if I suspect this guy's working for the Iranians or any other hostile power in the world, I'm going to tell him, I don't want to meet you here. Let's meet at, 6 o'clock tomorrow morning in front of the Marriott. And so I'm going to be there at 6 o'clock the next morning in front of the Marriott. I'm going to pick him up in a car with a security officer in it. And I know that the Iranians are going to be surveilling me because they're going to want to know where I'm taking this guy as we have this conversation. But what the Iranians don't know is that then I have a dozen guys behind them taking pictures of them and their license plates that we can run through our databases to see, is this the Iranians? Is it the Russians? Is it the Chinese? Who's trying to run this operation against us? That's what counter surveillance is.
How many fractal layers of this are there?
It can be.
The Iranians probably have somebody following the people who were following you.
And they actually did at one point on motorcycles, which we thought, wow, good for them. That was really sophisticated. But what they didn't know is that we had another layer behind that.
Nailed that one. So this is the Rob Kall Bottom Up Show. You can listen to it on Progressive Radio Network, on Pacifica. You can access it at opednews.com/podcasts. I publish opednews.com. It's a blog that reaches a couple 100,000 unique people a month. We publish 500 to 1,000 articles a month. We publish your work. Thank you for the permission to do that.
Thank you. Thank you for getting the word out.
Yeah. So tell us a little more about what you learned that helped you in prison. What else? That not only in prison but afterwards, since then, has helped you? What is the number one thing that you think people could use that you learned as a CIA agent that they could take and use in their lives, in their work?
Very simply, it's to trust no one. Prison is such a terrible place. Everybody, something like 85%, I read a study, 85% of people in prison suffer from mental illness. 85%. Most of those people suffer from antisocial personality disorder. So it's, not serious.
Which is a step away from psychopath or sociopath.
Exactly right. And so no one in prison, just like no one in the CIA or no one in Congress or no one in the White House, is going to do something for you out of the goodness of their hearts. They're going to do something for you because it somehow benefits them. And so I learned to trust absolutely no one. And it served me well. That sounds so awful.
It does.
But it served me well in prison. And another thing too in prison, you got to keep a low profile. And one of the ways to really keep yourself safe is to get others to do your dirty work, but make them think that it's their idea. I tell another story in the book. There was a serial killer of women in the prison with me. He was a long-distance truck driver, and he was murdering prostitutes all along his truck route in the western United States. Well, this was in the days before DNA testing. And so the cops knew that this was the guy because he had strangled several of the prostitutes, but they lived. He hadn't killed them. So they knew, well, this is the guy that's killing all these prostitutes, but we can't prove it. So they ended up getting him on rape charges, and he got the maximum. He got 20 years. The cops were so upset that he only got 20 years that when he got out after serving the full 20, they provoked him into violating parole. And then when they went into his house to search, they found a weapons cache, which made it a federal crime, and he got another 20 years. So even though he was never found guilty of the murders per se, he ended up with 40 years in prison. When I first got there, I was warned to stay away from him. He was extremely volatile and very violent. I mean, he would just turn his cellmates into a bloody pulp if they disturbed him while he was napping, or if they turned the lights on when he wanted the lights off. He was insane and violent. But for whatever reason, Rob, this guy actively sought my approval. So every once in a while in the TV room, he would come and sit next to me. And he would say, oh, he was in the CIA, and it was all nonsense. He was just making it up just to try to win my approval. And I was very careful. I kept him at arm's length. Well, there was another guy also in our unit who was a rat and who was doing 20 years on a murder for hire charge. I did not like this guy from the get-go, not just because he was a rat, but I was repulsed by his crime. He murdered his best friend after taking out a $100,000 life insurance policy on him because he owed the mafia $100,000 in gambling debts. So I was just repulsed by this guy. So the guy didn't like me because I would not allow him to move into my room. I said, I don't like you. I don't like your crime. and I don't like that you're a rat, which
And you get to say who moves in with you?
Oh, yeah. Because otherwise somebody's going to get killed.
Okay.
So I was sitting in the TV room one day, and the murder for hire guy didn't see that I'm sitting 5 feet away from him. And he says to another prisoner standing next to him, you know, that Kiriakou, he got called down to the lieutenant's office today, which was true. I had been called down to ask if I wanted to do an NPR interview. There was a request from NPR. They called him down because he's a rat, and he's ratting us out. And I'm sitting next to the serial killer, who we called Truck. I'm just sitting there. And Truck says to me, did you just hear that, MFer? He just called you a rat. And I thought to myself, here's my chance. And so very calmly, I said to him, 2 hours ago, I heard him call you a child molester. And so Truck, without saying a word, got up, walked over there, and beat this guy to within an inch of his life. So he was charged with assault. They added several years onto his sentence. They moved him up to a medium security prison. And the murder for hire guy spent 6 months, first in the hospital and then in solitary confinement for his own safety. So I got rid of these guys with one offhanded comment. I mean, this was a very tough and nasty and cynical thing to do, but it got rid of 2 people who were legitimate threats to my safety. And so I did it.
Wow. You are not somebody to mess with.
No, sir.
So you wrote, while you were in prison, you wrote a series of articles, letters from Loreto.
Yes.
Is that something that any prisoner can do?
Yes, that's a great question. For whatever reason, most prisoners believe that once they've been convicted of a crime, they somehow magically lose their constitutional rights. And people were saying, you're going to go to solitary, man. You're going to go to solitary if you keep provoking them like this. And I would tell them, guys, I have a constitutional right to freedom of speech, and I intend to exercise that right. You guys are wrong. You've not lost any rights. You've lost your freedom. But the Constitution still protects you just like it protects everybody else. Well, these letters from Loreto were originally supposed to be just a very small, closely held email. Right before I went to prison, Jane...
I'm laughing because I read, you've described what happened with them.
Yeah. Jane Hampshire, who at the time was the publisher of FireDogLake.com, said to me, hey, when you get to prison, when you feel comfortable, send us an email telling us how you're doing, and I'll send it around to your supporters. There were like 600 people who had expressed interest in receiving an update. I said, okay. I waited about 10 weeks, and I wrote the first letter from Loreto. I was inspired by Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. And so...
Something to be inspired by.
You know, he's just such a giant and a beacon in my life. And I'm not comparing myself to Martin Luther King. I could never shine Martin Luther King's shoes. But letter from Birmingham jail was an inspiration for me. So I wrote this letter, and not even really thinking about it, I blew the whistle on 2 crimes that had been committed against me. One was this aggressive harassment by a female guard, and the other was 2 of the cops in the Special Investigative Service office tried to set me up to beat, or worse, to kill an Arab prisoner. And then they actually did the same thing to him to try to beat or to kill me. But they were just so ham-handed about it. I went up to him and I said, hey, did the cops say anything to you about me? And he said, yeah, after we met and shook hands, they told me that you called a number in Washington and they told you to kill me. And I said, well, they told me that after we met, you called a number in Pakistan and they told you to kill me. So I wrote about this and I sent it to Jane Hampshire. But I didn't know that Jane was good friends with Arianna Huffington. And so she sent my email to Ariana and she said, hey, check this out. John Kiriakou just sent this to me. And Ariana put it with this banner headline on the Huffington Post. Well, I got more than 1 million hits from that first letter from Loreto. And I thought, my God, I have a soapbox here. I can reach people.
Were there consequences, though?
Oh, yeah.
I've been dealing with indirectly Dan Siegelman, the former governor of Alabama, and
the man's been horribly wronged.
He's been treated terribly. Medicines withheld, moving him away from where his family was. I mean, I was thinking, wouldn't that happen to you? Why didn't that happen to you?
Another great question. So right after this thing was published, my cousin came to visit me from Pittsburgh. And when I finally got called into the visiting room, as soon as I sat down, he said, hey, I just heard a conversation that I think is really important. He said, when I was waiting to come in here, 2 guards were talking about you. And one of them said, who's this guy here to visit? Kiriakou, the CIA guy. One guard said, why isn't that guy in solitary for writing this letter from Loreto? And the second guard said, I asked the warden that, and the warden said that we can't put him in solitary because he didn't use any of our names. And I said, Kip, do you have any idea what a valuable piece of intelligence this is? This gives me carte blanche to say anything I want. I can accuse them of anything I want. And so long as I don't use their names, there's nothing they can do to me. Now, there actually was. They would come in and just trash my room. They threw my pictures of my children on the floor and walked on them. They threw all my food. They dumped out all my food on the floor. You know, stuff like that. They would harass me. They would call me a traitor when I would walk past them in the cafeteria. So, you know, there was petty harassment. And finally, I said to one of them, I said, listen, I have gone nose to nose with Al-Qaeda, with Hezbollah, with the Iranians, and I'm supposed to be afraid of you? Please, don't make me laugh. Give me a little credit. And then eventually, they backed off because they saw that I was not backing off.
Would you give advice to other prisoners to do what you did?
Absolutely.
Talk about that. Give some advice to prisoners.
You have rights. Know your rights. My God, read the Constitution. It's not that long. If you can't even read the Constitution, read just the Bill of Rights, because those are the rights that you have not given up going to prison. And then in your dealings with the guards, be respectful if they show you respect, but don't ever back down, because they will. They'll back down. They always do. The bottom line is they're cowards. They're uneducated yokels from the hills somewhere around the prison, and they're cowards. They'll back down.
More advice to them on the writing side of it. How do they do it?
Oh, listen.
What do they write about?
Oh, write about daily life. First of all, for you as a prisoner, writing is therapeutic. It helps you work through some of these stressors and through the post-traumatic stress disorder that we all ended up getting. So it's therapeutic and it's calming. And you know, once you have your thoughts on paper, you can do something with it. Another thing too is there are a half a dozen different literary organizations out there that encourage prisoners to write. There are actually writing contests. And one of them is Yale University. They actually publish these prison letters that people send in. You know, I won one of the...
I'd like to say, just to be clear, Op-Ed News would love to see letters from prisoners and love to publish them.
That's a great idea. Barrett Brown, when he was in prison, was writing for The Intercept and a couple of other places and won a National Magazine Award for his writing, which I found to be both brilliant and hilarious. The guy's got an amazing sense of humor. But for letters from Loreto, and I wasn't really sure, I mean, I knew people were reading them, but I wasn't sure if I was having any kind of impact on anybody. I ended up winning one of the country's 4 top literary awards. I won the Penn First Amendment Award for those letters from Loreto. And I realized that people really were paying attention, and that it was my side of the story that was going to be the side of record.
How about the other prisoners? Did they read what you wrote?
Oh, As soon as Ariana published that first one, and it went crazy, the guards began passing it around. So there were two camps. There was the side that just thought they were great and that they were funny. And guards would come up to me very discreetly and say, that last one, that was the best one yet. Yeah, you really captured Sarge, you know? Or the fat guy in the cafeteria, you really nailed it. Good for you.
You ought to be a consultant on Orange is the New Black.
Yeah, I've exchanged countless letters with Piper Kerman about that.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh,
She's been a big supporter of mine. It's great.
Oh, that's awesome.
So once the guards started passing it around, the prisoners started passing it around. Because don't forget, all these prisoners have family members on the outside, and they're constantly Googling, FCI Loreto, just to see what's going on inside the prison. There are even chat rooms just dedicated to FCI Loreto, or to every prison, rather, where family members can talk about experiences. So
we got to wrap in a minute or two, by the way.
Sure. This was popping up in Google, and people would print it off and send it to their relatives who were incarcerated.
So one thing I'll point out is if you're in prison and you're writing, or if you're writing about prison, you want to make sure that you do use certain terms so that people will find them when they're doing searches.
Yes, absolutely. Use the name of the prison. It'll always pop up.
Yeah. Anything you want to wrap up with?
This book is supposed to be in part a serious political science-y kind of look at the American justice system. And I think I did that successfully. The other part is supposed to be funny. I'm not really the monster that I said I was a little bit earlier on this show. It's supposed to be in part tongue-in-cheek. And I hope that makes for a successful read. So far, the reviews have been terrific. I hope people enjoy it.
It's fascinating and funny, too.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
It's the Rob Kall Bottom Up Radio Show. Been listening to my interview with John Kiriakou, a former CIA spy. And what are you doing now? Real quick, in 30 seconds.
I've got a column at Reader Supported News. I write once a week. I speak a lot at colleges and universities around the country. And Oliver Stone and I have a show that's in development with the History Channel right now.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.